So we're doing a background job in the action cable channel being called from the stimulus controller, which will then update the container to do a turbo broadcast for the status. And you can sort of see how all this stuff ties together. Confirm. So this starts the entire container, sends it off to my server, and oh, would you look at that? I'm doing something in a different Rails app, completely built differently, but because of the Docker API gem, it pulls the logs, colors included, just like that. Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a look at a Docker API project. Now this is going to be a lot more involved than just looking at the Docker API gem, so I would highly recommend sticking around because I guarantee you're going to learn a trick or two when we go through what this project can do. The basic idea of this project, or the inspiration behind it, is the website I've been working on recently, which is running on a Jumpstart Pro template. This allows you to start and stop various game containers without needing to configure the server beforehand. It does all of this with Docker, and one of the tools that I use in there is the Docker API gem. The Docker API gem allows you to get things like the status of the containers or the logs of the containers very easily. You just call one method on the Docker API object and it just spits out what you need. Without that, you're constantly forced to like parse the status or go through the logs, and it's kind of a pain. So that's very nice to have that wrapper. But what we're going to be working on here is sort of like a mimic of the SaaS I've been working on, which just lets you start, stop containers. And then if you click in here, you can see the logs for that container. If I connect to this Minecraft server here, you can see the logs automatically populate, and you get all the usual stuff that comes with running one of these. So you can see here, you can see that Dean set his game mode to creative, etc. If I click stop, it stops the container, the logs go away, etc. And if you wanted to, you could even execute commands in this container because this is running Xterm. Like I said, we're going to be covering a lot of stuff here, but hopefully you get the idea. This is going to give us a whole bunch of stuff to take a look at, probably some things to learn too, and we'll see where we go from here, right? But let's go ahead and let's get started. Okay, so what we want to do is stop our server. And we're going to want to create a new project. For this, I'm going to do a Rails new video with a -J of ES build and a -C of Tailwind. And then we're going to go ahead and run that. Actually, I'm going to have to switch my Ruby versions first so then we can run that. So the Xterm here is traditionally used as a way to do input and output. If you've ever used Portainer before, so if you've ever used Portainer before, you've probably seen this type of console. You can come in here to one of these and let's go to, like, let's say vanilla with the boys. We come over here to the console itself. We connect as the root. And then you can see in here that we can, print dir and check through the entire server just like we would in a regular session in our terminal. So that's what Xterm allows you to do if you configure it properly. In this case, we're just using it for the logs, but I wanted to show you at least how to set it up because there's no better time than the present to cover some of this stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and start the VS Code window real quick, and then we're going to generate what we need. So the first thing we need is the containers, right? So we're going to say Rails G container, and we're going to give each container a name of type string, a status of type string. And I'm going to go ahead and set my GitHub info here. The container name will just validate so that it matches what the container name should look like. The status will just be a string because it just needs to be running or whatever. We can go ahead and do a scaffold for these things, and we can run this. Next, we need to generate a stimulus controller. So we're going to say Rails G stimulus console is what we're going to call our console controller. We then need to do a Rails G channel, because we need a channel for our container to communicate with this console. So we can go ahead and run that. So that's going to generate our action text channel. Next, we're going to have to set up a couple of jobs. So we're going to start by doing a Rails G job. We're going to generate a stream container logs job. This is what's actually going to grab the logs with our Docker API gem and stream it. And then finally, we want to do a Rails G job, but it's going to be for a container job. This is going to be the thing that starts and stops our containers. So we're going to start with, no pun intended, the start and stop buttons, and then we're going to move to the terminal. So how do we do that? Well, let's start by doing a bundle add for the Docker-API gem. and we can go ahead and run that. Then we're going to have to do a yarn add for our Xterm stuff, which we can just add real quick while we're here. So we're going to do a yarn add, and we're going to add Xterm, at Xterm/Xterm, and then we're going to add Xterm-add-on-fit. This actually needs to be Xterm like that. The add-on fit just allows us to resize it, just lets you make it responsive. It's just a little plugin for Xterm. So now that we're done with that, the last step here is going to be to come into the proc file. And this one's more for me because I'm running so many servers locally. I'm going to make Rails run as port 3002 instead of 3000. And I can't do 3001 because that's my Rust app. So I'm a little bit overwhelmed right now, but that's okay. We'll come over here. We'll go to the root of our application. We'll run our pending migrations, and then we're good. Next, we're going to come over to the, if I can hit this, Control-P, routes, our config and our routes.rb. We'll set the root to be the containers controller index action, just like that. Okay, now let's get some styling in here. We have Tailwind, so let's make this look a little bit better. Let's come into app, views, layouts, application.html.erb. First things first, we're going to wrap the yield tag in a main, and we'll close the main right here. So we'll save that. You'll see that moves everything over. Cool. Next, we have the index page, which is the page we're currently on. So let's come over to that page, containers, index.html.erb. So first things first, let's just get rid of all of this and let's replace it. I'm going to F11 so you can read this real quick, but I'll walk you through it. We set the width to full. We check if there's a notice. So this is our flash notice at the top. If there is, we render it. There's all the Tailwind styling here if you want to use it. Link to the repository will be in the video description. We then set a display of flex for our containers here with the new container button. This is what's actually generated for you if you just do a -c Tailwind. When you do the ES build one, it doesn't generate these styles for you. Drives me absolutely up the walls. So I've kind of replicated it here. The only other thing I've done is I've moved this these two lines out of our partial. This generally comes in the partial. If we come over to the container, to the show page, I guess it's not even here in like the default application. So never mind. Just pretend that I've added these out of the goodness of my heart. We're just adding these links so that if you're on the index page, you can click show this container or edit. Okay. So now that we have that, let's come over here and let's refresh, and you can see containers and new container. We'll click on new container and you can see that makes a very ugly page. So now let's come into our new.html.erb file. And again, I'm going kind of fast over this because we're really just cleaning up the styling. There's nothing else here. So we just say new container, render the form, and make a back button. Now you can see that looks a little bit better. However, the form itself still kind of gross. So let's come into the form itself, and in the form itself right here, first thing we can do is get rid of the status. Don't need that. Now let's go ahead and let's clean up the rest of this. So we have our errors here. We then have our MY-5, that's margin Y-5. And if I hover over this, you can see what that means. It's just 1.25 rem. Then we have our name, label, and input field, and then our submit button. So all that does is just gives us a single bar right here. Cool. So let's go ahead and let's just say vanilla. We'll hit create container. That takes us to our show page. Our show page looks kind of cringe. Let's go ahead and let's clean that up. In our show page, what we want to do, and I'm going to skip the console for now, is we want to copy this. So we check if we have a notice. If we have a notice, we render it. We then render our container. We have an edit button, a destroy button, and a back to containers button. Save this and refresh. And there you go. That looks a little bit better. Okay. Next, let's come over to the edit page. If we come to the edit page, it kind of looks okay, but there's still something missing. Can't quite put my finger on it, but that's okay because we can just do a paste right here to add our form, our show, and our back buttons. Again, this is all straight from like the basic template. It just lets you get caught up if you don't have it already. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's add the rest of the functionality to the application. So let me close all of these things. So the first thing I want to do is when I come to the show page right here, I want to grab the status, right? So if we come into our controller, this is going to be the containers controller. So app controllers, containers controller. There's some things we have to do in here. First thing I want to do is on the show page, I want to call a refresh status. And then that's going to be in our container model. So if we come over here to the container model, if we come up to app models container.rb, we're going to put a bunch of stuff in here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to validate the name. So we're going to say this has to validate the name. It's going to validate presence true, uniqueness true, because you can only have one of each container. And then for the format, we have to do something a little bit ugly because we have to validate this with a regex that matches the Docker regex. So all this does is it says this can be, let me copy the comment over here. This can be a name that is alphanumeric, so letters or numbers are allowed, hyphens and underscores are also allowed. That's all this is doing. But in our container, we had this refresh status. So what does refresh status do? All it does is when you come to your show page, it just calls update and sets the status to be the Docker status. Now, what's the Docker status? You may be asking yourself. Well, this is going to be the first place where we actually use the Docker API. So to do this, we need to use something like docker::container.get and then the name. So this is going to give you your Docker container. So this is going to be your Docker container. But I don't want to do this right here. Instead, I want to create a separate method for this. So we're just going to come up here and we're going to say def docker container. So we'll call container.docker container whenever we want to access this. And then we'll just return this. So we're turning this kind of like into a variable, right? But sometimes you won't find the container, in which case you'll need to rescue from this, and then we'll just return nil instead. So now we can use that over here, and we can say the info for our Docker status is going to be docker_container and .info. We do the and because if the Docker container doesn't exist, we'll get a nil error when we call .info. But with the and, we don't get a nil error. We just get nil for our info. But what does this actually look like? Because I'm just kind of saying words at you right now, right? Well, in my case, I have a vanilla Minecraft server running that I have aptly named vanilla. So whatever container you want to grab the name for, just make sure you know what the name is. In my case, it's this one. I do have a compose file running this, so I also have vanilla up here, but I'm really focused on this vanilla right here, okay? So we use that vanilla right there to just get the container. So let's go ahead and let's do a Rails C real quick. In the console, what we'll do is we'll say container equals container.first. So that's the container we just made. If I now call container.inspect, we can see this container has a name of vanilla, right? So let's do container.docker container, okay? So that gives us all of this stuff. So this is our info block right here, which is what we're grabbing. Inside of that info block, we have a state, and inside of that state, we have a status. Now you can see here, this is really neatly organized, right? This is all coming from the Docker API gem. We call info, we call state, we call status, and we can check if this is running. And just to prove this to you, that this is actually working, we can actually move this over here. I can go ahead and I can stop this vanilla server. And then if we come over here and we run the container status again, I expect this running here will change. So we can see here the status switched to exited. Let's go ahead and let's run this again. And now we can see the status is exited. So we just have to access that. And the way we do that is by saying, well, we have the info here. Next, let's go ahead and let's do a state is equal to info and .dig state, right? And we can test this by just running this in our console. So, and we could test this over here. Sorry, my terminal keeps resizing itself. It's driving me nuts. If we do container.docker_container.info, you can see we get the info. We can then do a state if we want to, which gives us the state. And then we can do a status, which gives us exited. So we grab the state, we grab the status, and now we have the status over here. So let's just go ahead and let's just return this. To return this, we don't actually need to keep the return keyword, just as a reminder. So let me go ahead and exit out of this, run a bin/dev again to start our server. We'll come over here and we'll refresh. And now you can see this just updates to exited because we call that right here where it refreshes the status. Refresh status calls update, passes in the Docker status, which uses the Docker container, and then it digs for the state. It's that easy, right? If I come over here and I start this again, just click on start, takes a second, we refresh, this now says running. Cool. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and let's make sure this updates whenever we refresh the page. So we're just going to say after update, broadcast update to the container stream. So this is where we're using Turbo. Like I said, you're going to be learning something here, even if I have to come up with 100 different things to show you before you learn one thing. So in our show page over here, we want to make sure that we're streaming from this Turbo stream. So we'll come up here to the top and just say Turbo stream from containers, because that's what we called it over here. It'll just broadcast that update to here, and it handles it perfectly. The other thing we have to do is we have to make sure that we're broadcasting to containers from the index page. So let's come over here and let's paste this right here. So now I know what you're thinking. What does that actually do for us? Well, if I come over here and I open this up in a new tab like this, and I come over here, every time we run this, it'll do a broadcast. So if I stop this server, and then let's say we have like multiple users, one of them refreshes the page, we'll just wait for this to stop. And then if I refresh, you'll see that both of them switch over to exited. That's all it's doing. It's just updating the page. But it's actually a little bit cooler than that, because this will also broadcast other updates as time goes on, because we're just updating the entire container. But okay, now that we have that, let's go ahead and let's do the coloring of the status real quick, because that's actually really easy to do. So what we do is we come into our container partial, and we need to sort of change this partial because it's really gross looking. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to grab these bits right here, paste these in. Then in here, this is normally where you would do the status, but I'm going to go ahead and do this instead. We set a color equal to the container status. If the container status is equal to running, we make the color green. Otherwise, we make it red. Then we say, here's our status. We just put it in a font medium. And then for the actual color itself, Tailwind sets text color as a class by doing text dash the color, which will be green or red, dash some number to make it more or less, I don't know, like vibrant, if you want to look at it like that. Let's refresh. Now you can see this is green because we're started, and it'll be red if we stop the container. Of course, kind of self-explanatory there. I'll just stop this and I'll refresh it when I see it change off screen. Okay, now what I want to do is create a start and a stop button. So for this, we're going to come up here to right below our header. I'm going to do another P, but instead of the image here, I'm going to do a flex item center, close this div to clean everything up. And then we have to close the P tag as well. I don't know why this was wrapped in a P tag. There's a little bit of spaghetti code on my part. That gives us something up here. You can see the status has also changed to exited. That's a happy little coincidence there. Let's go ahead and let's create two buttons. First one, we're going to call start with the start container path. We pass in the container. We give it a method of put. We give it these classes. We'll do the same thing for a stop container button. Goes to stop container path, different classes, so that it's a different color, I think, is how I did this. But when we refresh, we run into an error because these paths don't exist yet. So let's come over to config, and let's come into routes.rb. And in our routes.rb, I need to find my notes. We need to create a put. We'll do that up here. A put to containers /id/start goes to the containers controller start action as start container. And then we do the same thing for stop. We just switch each start to a stop, and then we're good. We can come over here and refresh. Now we get a blue button and a red button. If we click start, you'll see nothing happens because our controller doesn't have those actions yet. So we have to come into our containers controller. At the top of this file, we need to add a start and stop to our set containers so we can use @container inside of them. And then we can come down here, and this is where we're going to start getting into some background jobs. Like I said, we're learning today. I'm going to make sure there's some learning that happens. So we say container job, which we created earlier, .perform later, which means it runs in the background, and then we pass in @container and start. We then redirect to the container URL with a notice saying starting container. We do the exact same thing for stop, except of course we switch the word, and then we switch this word. Let's refresh, click on start. You can see starting container appears here. Nothing else does though. So what I also want to do is come into our application.css. So app assets, style sheets, application.css. In here, I want to set the notice to be animation fade out 700 millisecond, ease in 5 second forward. with a fade out, an opacity of 0, and a display of none, which just makes this disappear over time. So we click on start, and then after like 5 seconds, this should hopefully like start to fade and then disappear just like that. Cool. We have a working animation. Why does that work? Well, we set it to the notice ID. If we come over to the show page, we have a notice right here with an ID of notice. That's how we do it. Okay. So there you go. Now you've learned maybe some styling. I don't know, but I'm going to make you learn something here. Let's come over to our jobs now. So I'm going to close all this. We'll come over to app. We'll come into jobs, come into container job. Remember, this is where we're passing in start and stop. So somehow we're making this start and stop the container. Now this is going to be really scary and really complicated because we're using the Docker API. Just kidding. It's actually going to be incredibly simple. How do we start a container with the Docker API? We just call container.docker container to get that Docker container. Remember how we did it in the terminal. We just want to grab that Docker ::container.get. So we do this get by name. Then we call start if action is equal to start. And then you can already guess how we're going to stop the container just like that. Now, after we do whatever actions these may be, it's going to take a little bit. That's why we do it in the background job. This can take like 45 seconds to several minutes. I think Project Zomboid actually says it takes like 45 minutes sometimes, which is horrifying. But once this is done running in the background and your stuff gets updated, we probably want to update the status. And remember, we have this refresh status here, which is a little strange. It's almost like I spent a lot of time today figuring out how to make this work. But there you go. There's your third line. If we come over here now and we click on start, this will run in the background and then boom, status is now running and our container is up again. If I click on vanilla and we look at the logs, you'll see there's some stuff happening here. And then eventually this will go to online again. It takes a minute. The status says running, but it's really like setting up. But of course, Docker has no way of knowing what the difference between a running state is and Minecraft letting players connect, right? But okay, we have that working. Now, what's the next step? Well, let's make sure we can stop the container. Don't want to have too much fun over here, so that'll stop the server. This will run through, and then eventually this will end up stopping, and then you can see here that switches to exited without having to refresh. Okay, so let's close all of these things because now it's time for the fun part. We have a start, we have a stop. Let's do a terminal. Let me close all of the stuff I have over here. Okay, for the terminal, there's a couple things we're going to have to set up. First, let's come into config, initializers, new file, call this redis.rb. We have to set up our Redis server to make sure that we can actually store some stuff inside of it. So let's come into redis.rb, which I have you in right now. And then we're just going to do something like this. Require Redis. We set $Redis equal to redis.new. We give it a URL of env Redis URL. So if you have an environment variable set, it'll use that. Otherwise, it'll just use localhost. If you don't have Redis installed, make sure you can run redis-server as a status. So we'll say, I don't know, like sudo service redis-server start. I can never remember which order it goes in. So there you go. It says starting Redis server. If you don't have it, make sure you install it on your system. Then we can come over here to our cable.yaml real quick and just make sure our development is set to adapter Redis, URL Redis, localhost, blah, 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 blah. And that'll let you use it. The reason why we're doing this is because we need to actually set something in the Redis DB to cache it. You'll see what I mean in a minute here. We have our Xterm added. Let's go ahead and let's add it to our views. Let's come into app, views, containers, and the container show page. In the container show page, I want to make sure that we can actually see this terminal. How do I do that? Well, if you remember earlier in our app JavaScript, controllers, we have the console controller. So let's go ahead and let's bind that bad boy real quick. So we say data-controller equals console. So we're using stimulus, and then data-console-id-value is equal to the container.id. And then we give it an ID of terminal because that's what Xterm tells us. Okay, so that lets us refresh. If I run a bin/dev real quick, that lets us refresh, and then we can see nothing on the page because we didn't actually do anything yet. So let's come over to our console controller. Now this is going to be a little bit ugly because unfortunately Xterm has some setup required. So let's get started by just importing Xterm real quick. So we'll import both of those and then we'll just run a console.log saying we connected to the console controller. I'll hit Control-Shift-I and we can see that down here so we know we're connected. Cool. Next step, I want to make sure that we can actually log out our ID value. So let's refresh, and we don't have an ID value. Why is that? Well, to the surprise of no one, we need to actually define it up here. So we say static values equals ID value, and now you can see we're grabbing ID of 1, just like up here. Cool. Next, this is going to be used a little bit later. Let's just set an interval ID equal to null, and you can see this is used for clearing later. We'll take a look at what that means in a little bit. Let's start by setting up our terminal. Now, because I'm a good little coder, I made this into a small little helper method. So let's go ahead and let's set this up. I guess we can do it after we do the disconnect. We'll do the disconnect right here. We'll use this later, and then we'll do our setup terminal like this. Okay, so how do we set up a terminal? Well, we start by saying this.terminal equals new terminal, and then we can close this. And now there's some options you can set in here. One is convert EOL. This just converts your line endings. You can see right here when you're set to the next line, every new line, this is equivalent to sending /r/n, which is just a new line, right? Cool. Let's change the font family for the terminal. Change it like that. Let's change the font size. Well, we can change it just like that. We can set the cursor to blink if we want to. And we can even make it so that we scroll back to 100 lines so that we don't have more than 100 lines on the page. Let's go ahead and let's refresh now. Sorry, let me refresh. And then you can see nothing changes. Why does nothing change? Well, because we're not done yet. I'm tricking you. We'll come down here. We'll create a fit add-on. Again, this is just to make it responsive. How do we add the fit add-on to our terminal? We call this.terminal.load add-on, and we pass in fit add-on. Now, how do we actually open the terminal? We call this.terminal.open on this.element, which is the element this is attached to, which has our ID. If we refresh now, you can see there's a little thingy here that lets me interact with it, but we're not quite there yet. Why is that? Well, we probably have to call this.addon fit. We do that, nothing seems to happen. Why do you think that is? Well, I'll let you guess for a little bit, and then I'll reveal it to you. We can come over here to the node modules. We can come to the Xterm, CSS. You can see there's a CSS file here that we're not including anywhere. So let's come up to our app, our assets, our style sheets, our application.tailwind.blah, nobody cares. Let's import that at xterm/xterm/css/xterm.css, refresh the page, and now you can see we have a lovely terminal here. Can't do anything with it though. So how do we do stuff with this terminal? Well, we got to keep going, right? Let's come over here. Let's hit F11, and let's just say we're largely done with our setup terminal here, but let's go ahead and let's add an event listener. When we resize the window, let's call fit-addon.fit just so it resizes it. Cool. Next thing, we want to actually do some logging to this. So if I come over here and I refresh, there's nothing logging here, right? So our server stopped, but I'd really like it if we could actually do some logging. So to do that, let's say this.createChannel. Now I know what you're thinking, create channel. Doesn't that normally happen in a stimulus channel? Well, that's what we're doing here. Actually, we're creating our stimulus channel, but we're going to do it inside of our action cable channel. But we're going to do that inside of our stimulus controller because, like I said, I wanted to teach and we're going to learn today. So let's go ahead and let's create this create channel method. Just like this, create channel. All right, so first thing I want to do is I want to hit F11 and I want to set this up. It's a bit of a monstrosity, so bear with me, but we just say this.docker console equals consumer, which means up here we have to import our consumer, right? And again, we're importing this from /channels/consumer. So that's what this is. And this is used by Action Cable in the documentation. You've probably seen it in other videos. So we use consumer.subscriptions.create. We set the channel to be the container channel. And then we pass in this.id value because we need to know exactly which container we're using this in. That's why we set that ID value earlier. Next, we say connected, console.log. We're connected to the container channel. And then we call this.fetch logs. Now, before we do the fetch logs, let's just get through the rest of the connections. We'll do a disconnected method, and then we'll do a received. We'll say received, and we can just write it to the terminal. Sure, this is also how you write. If you want to write a line, you can just type write ln instead. The reason why we're using a colon in parentheses with an arrow function is because we need to use this inside of our subscription here. So we're binding the context or whatever JavaScript cringy stuff is said. And then we're good here. So let's go ahead and let's create this fetch logs real quick so that we can move on with our lives. Fetch logs is really easy. We just say fetch logs, and we call this.docker console, which is our action cable channel, .perform fetch logs. We pass in the ID. What does perform and fetch logs mean? Well, this is action cable, so you got to remember that. We come up here to channels and we come into the container channel. I told you, you're going to learn today. In here, what I want to do is in the subscribe method, I want to stream from container underscore logs underscore the ID. That's the action cable channel that we're going to be broadcasting to. So we have turbo, we have action cable, we have stimulus, all everything I could possibly think of in here. We'll then log this out, and then we'll do fetch logs. Remember, we're calling perform fetch logs, which we can actually just call like methods on the back end by doing that. We can come down here and we can say, well, actually, I'm going to put this after the unsubscribe. We can come down here and we can say fetch logs, pass in some data. Container equals container.find data ID, because remember, we're passing the ID in right here. This entire block here is the data. Whatever you put in here, you access the variables by doing your square brackets and the variable name. Then we can do streaming container logs job.perform later, and we pass in the container. So now we have to do another background job. So we're doing a background job in the action cable channel being called from the stimulus controller, which will then update the container to do a turbo broadcast for the status. And you can sort of see how all this stuff ties together. Unfortunately, I'm realizing now I didn't create any helpers in this, so I'll have to apologize for that. But we can come down here to the jobs and the stream container logs job. And in the stream container logs job, we need to switch the perform to perform with the container. We then create a timestamp by calling container.log timestamp. Now that doesn't actually exist. So we have to come into our, our models and our container.rb. In our, our container.rb, we have to call this log timestamp. We do that by using that Redis we created earlier, because we have to get this last log timestamp ID to I. This is unique to each container. I'm storing the last time we got logs from Docker so that we can always get newer logs if we want them. We are going to have to reset this if we want to get all logs. So that's just something to be aware of. Let's go ahead and let's make sure that we can actually reset this. If we can reset this, we'll just do something like this, redis.delete this. So we can get it, we can delete it. Let's make sure that we can also set it. So we'll just do that right here. So it's just set, and we just set it to be time.now. So whenever we call this, it'll set the current time to be that. So now you can sort of see how all of these tie together. So let's come back over here to our job, and let's just make logs be an empty array. And then we check if that timestamp is nil or 0. This could happen initially, or if we set it to 0 somewhere. In that case, we want to get all of the logs from the Docker container, but we want to limit it to like 100 so that we're not, blowing up our front end, because I've done that before. If you load 10,000 logs in, your application doesn't load that page. It's not a fun bug to figure out. So let's go ahead and let's do Docker container. And so we're grabbing our Docker container again. Now, instead of doing .logs here, because that gives you some weird like beginnings to your line endings, you can actually do .streaming logs, and you can stream these in real time if you want to. We're going to do std out of true, std error of true, but we're not going to do follow. We're going to actually do tail, and we're going to grab the tail end of 100, just like that. Now we're going to do an else block where we say if the timestamp wasn't 0, we're going to say logs is equal to container.docker container, if it exists, .streaming logs, std out, std error, and then instead of tail, we're going to do since for the last timestamp, and we're going to do a tail of 100. Then we're going to come down here. After we've done that, we can say unless log.empty, just like this. We can then do logs as array, we'll do right here. Logs as array is equal to logs.split by new line. This gives us a neat little array that we can then broadcast from our background job to our action cable server. Broadcast container logs channel again. Remember, it's based on that ID. And then in our data, we're passing a output variable that has all of our logs in it. After we do this, we then call that set timestamp in our container. Remember, we have to set this time somewhere so that we know later which time we're grabbing logs after. After all of that's done, we can come over here and we can refresh and nothing will happen. You can see right here, we're getting some errors. We get a undefined local variable or method log for an instance of stream container logs job, right? where is that coming from? Well, we have logs right here. Let's go ahead and let's refresh. Didn't expect the error, but I did expect it to not work. So that's on me. So now we don't have an error, but we also don't have any logs. That's because our front end isn't doing anything with the logs yet. So join me on one last adventure today as we actually hook up these logs. The way we do this is we come into our received in our channel. And instead of doing a write line for data.content, remember, we're getting back a data.output, right? Data.output. So let's save this and then let's hit Control-Shift-I and then refresh. And then you can see here, nothing's really happening. So there's a couple things to consider. One, we're not receiving this data, but that's because we're also not fetching this data. We haven't requested the data yet. So how do we do that? Well, let's worry about one thing at a time. To do the initial fetch, we want to do that in here. This calls the fetch, but the loop's not quite complete yet. So we still have to do a couple of things. Let's add in a data.output, because remember, we're getting back an array for each. So we loop through each line in the array, and then we call this .terminal.writeLine just to sort of close that loop. And then we call this .terminal trim terminal buffer. And this is where we limit it to 100 lines, just because I've had some weird behavior with the scroll back. So we're going to do a manual trim here. We say terminal buffer equals this .terminal.buffer.active. We then say lines to trim equals terminal buffer.length minus 100. As you can imagine, this took me a hot minute to figure out how to do. And we say if lines to trim is greater than 0, we call this .terminal buffer active trim start, and that gets rid of our lines. So we're limited to 100 lines. Hopefully, I think that works. Okay, now we need to do a couple more methods here to get this to actually finally work. The first one is we need to set up some terminal hotkeys, because right now, if I come in here and I type something, nothing really happens. Don't really care for that. So how do we make stuff happen? Well, we need to do this set up terminal hotkeys real quick. We do that below the trim terminal buffer. All we do is we say this .terminal.onKey with a key and a DOM event inside of some braces. If you hit enter, we write a new line, and then we call this .send command. What's send command? Well, that's going to go to our Docker console, perform, receive, and then it just sends a command there. Now, this is admittedly something that I didn't implement here because I really didn't know what to make it do necessarily. But this is where if you had custom commands like print directory or something that had to run on the server, you would put it in here. So I'm just going to include a stubbed out receive method that takes in some data, and then it could do like a broadcast, or it could do some background logic. So now if you come in here and you type something and you hit enter, you'll see down here it receives this data, and then you could just do whatever you want to. So if you type pwd, maybe it returns the contents of a directory or something, just to give you a bit more to work with. But okay, so that's our send command here. The next thing we have to do is, after our setup terminal hotkeys, we have to do start log fetching. And as you can imagine, that's the secret sauce that makes it actually work. So we can come down here. We can start with start log fetching. We'll do this below send command. So this .interval ID, that variable we created earlier, and set it to null. This .interval ID is equal to set interval, this .fetch logs. So it calls fetch logs every 1,000 milliseconds, which is every second it'll call this. And then if we want to stop fetching logs, we just say clear the interval ID. We can then come up here, and you can see in our disconnect, what we're probably going to want to do here is tell it to stop fetching logs. Do that, come over here and refresh the page. Okay, so now we have the ability to start fetching, stop fetching, terminal stuff. We create our channels, we receive our data. And you can see here, this is running nonstop, but there's a couple of nuances here. One is we're not receiving any logs. Why do you think that is? Well, the timer is probably already set, this timestamp. So when we visit the show page, we want to make sure that we're clearing that. So let's come into our containers controller, scroll up to the top, and then in our show action here, we want to do one more thing, which is going to be a call to reset the log timestamp when you refresh the page. And just like that, your logs appear. The reason it wasn't working is because we have to actually tell it that on initial page load, we want to receive the last 100 logs or whatever you have there. And now you effectively have a working application. Let's go ahead and let's click start. Clears the logs. Logs appear. It says it's running. Now, this will take a minute. Always does. But eventually, this should hopefully start telling us that there's some ops files or something over here. If I refresh and move this over a bit. This is just a little bit quirky because Minecraft takes forever to do the initial setup for some reason. But then you can hopefully see that this works. And if you have other containers that you spin up, let's come back here to all of our containers. Let me just click on show real quick. Now, as far as I can tell, the reason why this happened, I think, is because if you hover over this, thanks to new changes in Rails, it like preloads the page. And then if you click on this, sometimes it just doesn't load the page like that. Now, the way that I can fix this, I think, is if we come into our container channel, we could do something like at container.reset log timestamp, but then we have to get at container. So we find it real quick. And now I think when we do that initial connection, it should always reset the timestamp, even if we preload. And you can see here in the console, when I hover over this, it does a refresh, right? And then we click on it, and it's still not quite doing that. So the other option that we could have here, because it seems like this one's not working, is if we come into our index page, we might have to make the show button have like turbo set to false or something because of turbo interfering with JavaScript or something to that effect. I'm not entirely sure. Let's do a turbo frame of container maybe. Does that work? Let's just check. Hover over this long enough. We can click, show, click, hover over it, edit, hover over it. I think this is working. This seems to be working now. Okay, so I'm going to assume this is working because I haven't seen it not work yet. Okay, so now that we have that, I mean, really the world's your oyster at this point, but let's come over here and let's just do this. So we have the ability to create a new container. I'm going to create one called Necessi. As soon as I remember how to spell it, let's come over here and let's create a new one. So we're going to say this is Necesse, I think. Necess, or whatever it's called. And then I'm going to make the container name Necess as well. Just like that. Default ports are all fine. We'll click create game. Okay, so this is going to be called Necesse, I think. Necessi. I think I misspelled the name, but that's fine. We'll click create. Nothing here exists yet. We're getting errors in our console like crazy because this doesn't exist yet. Undefined method empty. And this is coming from our container streaming logs. Yeah, streaming jobs right here in perform. So before I start this, let's go deal with that. Let's come over here to our stream container jobs. We do a empty check in here if at logs and empty, refresh. And now we should hopefully no longer get that specific error. But now we get a split because logs isn't empty. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. Actually, logs isn't empty. It is nil. So let's refresh, and that should hopefully fix it. There we go. Okay, so that gets rid of that. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and click Start, Confirm. So this starts the entire container, sends it off to my server, and oh, would you look at that? I'm doing something in a different Rails app, completely built differently, but because of the Docker API gem, it pulls the logs, colors included, just like that. Okay. So there you go. And if you want one more, we can do one more. Let's come back here. I'll show you another game. This is Valoran. I highly recommend Necessi, by the way. Valoran also. This is like a Cube World style game. So we come over here. We'll do Valoran. This will be Valoran, just like that. Click create game. Except this one's already taken. So let's come back to games real quick, and I'll just click start on this one. Click start, click confirm. Now, the Valoran logs are a little weird. It sometimes just doesn't generate logs for me. So in that case, I don't know if this was the best example to show you because it just does whatever it wants to sometimes. So that one's probably on me. I don't even think I have logs working for this one right now. But hopefully the other ones at least work, and you believe me that they work. yeah, the Valoran one's just going to be like that. But the other ones work just fine. And this works not just with games, of course, but with other containers as well. And then if you wanted to take it a step further, you could, add Portainer or something and, manage Portainer with this. And then in Portainer, do your actual heavy duty Docker management if you wanted to go that way. But that's going to do it for this video. I do apologize for the length of it. Hopefully you got something out of it. I tried to include a little bit of everything. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.